My name is Ryley, and you are listening to the Ryley Heppner podcast. As we begin, can I start with just asking you what your own journey into biblical scholarship looked like? Like, were there significant, I don't know, moments, revelations, experiences that stick out to you that led to a career, a calling, a ministry in New Testament studies?
Well, for sure. Like you had mentioned how you were called. I was called. My call to ministry was a call to share God's word, and so I uh, I didn't know exactly what that looked like. Initially, what I thought it would be, well, especially as I understood that focusing on the Bible and explaining the Bible, I thought that would be, just going from church to church and preaching in a bunch of different churches. Um, but I felt like the Lord wanted me to go to Bible college and learn Greek and Hebrew. So I went to learn Greek and Hebrew. And after my first couple of years there, I was going to then go out and preach. But I began to notice that my professors were training a lot of people in the Bible, and that kind of role you can train a lot of people. And I began to notice that the people who were writing also could have a big impact and serve a lot of people, and began to realize I could do more that way. But also, I just, as time went on, like I was reading 40 chapters of the Bible a day, and uh, really learning the Bible. I had to catch up because I was converted from completely unchurched atheism.
Okay.
But once I started getting into this, after a while, I realized that the authors were taking for granted things that they and their audience knew. I mean, not least the language in which they were writing, that that people today ordinarily don't know. And I already had some background in Greek and Roman literature and so on, but um, now I began to study it for the sake of understanding the Bible, and especially the Jewish sources, which I hadn't delved into before I became a Christian. And just once I started into it, to try to get the information, to feel like I really understood the background and could articulate this is the message of the text in light of all that background. By then I had a PhD. So I was kind of on the way at that point.
So I think it goes without saying, I think you essentially said this going into scholarship, that felt like a ministry for you. That was
Yeah,
a calling.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Is
it
that,
was.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I also felt like you can't expect everybody to do what I did. Um, and it wasn't what I'd planned to do. I was going to just, once I realized I needed a background, I just wanted like a reference book that I could take with me as I was getting ready to preach and pull out the background, all in one volume that I could carry with me as I traveled or whatever, until I finally realized, wow, already this has taken me like 10 years just to collect this much background. This book wasn't available at that time, so that's why I wrote the background commentary. And then some people said, you don't have enough documentation. Well, yeah, it was supposed to be one volume for those kind of people, not like you, but the kind of pastors who prepare their their Sunday sermon on Saturday night, or they preach on Saturday, their Friday night, whatever. So I like, okay, well, you want the footnotes? Here's the footnotes. So that's why I started writing these big commentaries that gave the documentation, but obviously they end up being multi-volume and so on when I go into that much detail.
Okay. As you have pursued this ministry of scholarship, have you felt encouraged by the church in terms of how you've been able to impart resources and wisdom to them?
Yeah, I have very much. I still struggle, um, eh, not as much as I used to, but I also knew the way that I came to Christ as somebody who was unchurched was there were people out in the street sharing the gospel. Um, and so I did that after. after I became a Christian, I was out in the streets sharing the gospel. And often I struggled with this while I was in seminary, while I was not so much when I was doing my doctoral work, because I had a good ministry on campus with the undergraduates. But I often struggled with, am I making enough of a difference? Would
Okay.
I make more of a difference reaching people one-on-one than I do with these commentaries? And in terms of evangelism, I'm not sure. But anyway, I try to work hard for everything that I am into this work on these commentaries to make it like this is the biggest difference I can make.
Yeah.
It seems to me like this is where I can make the biggest difference. I
Yeah.
feel the Lord's pleasure in doing this research, but sometimes I still, and I'm weighing and I'm like, oh, there's so many needs in the world,
Yeah.
but this is where I'm gifted, especially. So
Well, when I look at your Acts commentary, I mean, as it's stacked up, I always think this man has clearly been called to this purpose because who could, there's not many people, I think, that could so comprehensively prepare and present all the sources and the data like that. I think I think it's clear to me, I mean, not knowing you, that, the Lord custom cut, fit you, called you to what you were doing. And I'm so thankful that people like you exist, where God has called them to be.
thanks. I'm also ADHD.
Okay.
So, so, it helps me being interdisciplinary because I'm always thinking, oh, what about this? What about
Yeah.
over here? But, um, but there's a thing with ADHD where you go into hyper focus.
Okay.
So that has been very helpful. The ADHD itself is like,
Okay.
it entertains my students when I teach because they go off on tangents. But, um, but it can make concentration and sitting still hard unless I can go into hyper focus. But
Okay.
when that happens, may as well keep going all day.
But isn't that amazing then how the Lord has used your ADHD for such a kingdom purpose that, you get into that hyper focus, a place that a lot of people probably can't get into, which is a neat thing. I mean, a sovereign God, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Uh, Craig, of course, we're chatting about the book Christobiography, Memory, History, and Reliability of the Gospels. What initially led you to explore the relationship between ancient biography and the Gospels?
Actually, I'd been thinking about it for a long time. I mean, like before I was a Christian, I was reading Tacitus and Plato and
Oh,
um,
even before
oh yeah,
Christ. Okay.
way before, yeah, all those things. I was I was staying away from the Bible, but I was reading all these other things from antiquity. But then, um, so after I became a Christian, now some of the early comparisons I made were really way off, like Plato and Paul were not. Uh, I needed more of the Jewish material, but in terms of seeing the nature of the Gospels, they look to me like ancient biography. And that was already, when I mentioned I went to Bible college. In terms of later on, there were a number of scholars who had developed that. Actually, it was kind of the majority view throughout church history, if you define biography in a broad way, and kind of fell away in the early to mid 20th century in scholarship. But then you've got um, Charles Talbert was really brilliant. He broke ground on that. Not everybody paid attention, but David Downey developed that further. And then Richard Burridge, in his Cambridge monograph on the Gospels as ancient biographies, really, the consensus shifted. So that was actually the majority consensus by the time I was coming in on this. Well, I'd written some on historical Jesus research and had just mentioned, not at great length, about the nature of ancient biography and the Gospels. And by the time that was coming out, I realized, oh, wait, there's something I didn't mention because actually probably a lot of New Testament scholars haven't read enough ancient biographies to just take for granted that what I'm saying is correct. And sure enough, at least one of the reviews said, "Hey, how do we know this is correct?" So I said, "Okay, well, I got." So I did an article on it, but it was like I did a comparison with one ancient biographer and a couple of his biographies and the Gospels, and showed how, this one, it was very information based. It's not to say that they didn't have perspectives and so on, but it was definitely information based, just full of, depending on prior sources. So I was like, well, how do we explore all these sources? But my doctoral students in my um, historical Jesus course, I suggested one time, hey, you don't have to write your paper on this, but if you want to, uh, let's see if we can, you take this biographer, you take that by whichever biographer they wanted, and let's look at the evidence. And so, one of them took Diogenes Laertius, another, I think, took Tacitus's um, biography of his father-in-law, and so on. And they wrote really good papers. We put them together as a book, published the book, so we could all then depend on each other's research, because some of them decided to develop dissertations out of this.
Okay.
So even beyond what I have in Christobiography, there's even more information now. The Something else that I discovered, though, and this was from Arnaldo Momigliano, a classicist writing on ancient biography, was how the genre developed over time. And once I put the biographies in sequence, from the proto-biographies to hagiography and late antiquity over that 1,000-year period, in the middle of it is the apex of historiographic dependability. So in the period of the early empire, which is the period of the Gospels, actually from the end of the Roman Republic, Cornelius Nepos, until like Diogenes Laertius in the early 3rd century, what we have is um, biography almost as a subtype of historiography in general. It was very much oriented towards historical sources. And, that's really helpful for putting the Gospels in context as information-based works.
How would you summarize your main argument that the Gospels fit within the genre of ancient biography of bios?
Um, well, actually, I was following Talbert's argument on
Okay.
Talbert and Burridge, and their basic argument, because it was pretty much the consensus. It's not to say everybody holds that, and obviously around the edges, genres are not airtight, so they can overlap. But the basic way I would well, what I was doing was saying, okay, granted that the Gospels are biographies, what does that tell us about the information they provide? Because it looked to me like that was a lacuna in scholarship. It hadn't been done that much. So I found that the Gospels are information-based biographies. And it's kind of a three-pronged approach. Namely, first of all, they come from the period when biographies were most tied to historiography, most information-based. Also, also they are from within living memory, which only a minority of surviving ancient biographies were. So the fact that the all four of our first century gospels are by definition of being from the first century are from within living memory of Jesus' public ministry. Oral historiography usually counts the period of living memory, or what they call oral history versus oral tradition, like 60 to 80 years. So
Okay.
the period when eyewitnesses are still alive, or those who knew the eyewitnesses are still alive. Normally, the memory is much more information based or maybe more extensively information-based is a better way to put it. Because in later oral tradition, you've got um, some key features remembered, but not as much by any means.
So it's in your title, so I think this is rhetorical, but your aim at studying bios in this genre is to help us better understand the historical reliability of the Gospels. Was that kind of the main goal here?
Yeah, and so that we can recognize that what the Gospels um, that the Gospels are actually good sources for knowing about Jesus historically. And of course, there's a bunch of other factors that we take into account, but this gives us kind of a default setting, like the nature of ancient biography. If it tells you an episode or an event, I should say, then it's normally in this period because the biographer believed that that event happened. They have some sort of source that suggests that that event happened. So the the Gospels actually give us a lot of information about Jesus, even by a purely secular historiographic standard that we would hopefully use for most other Gospels, not most other Gospels, most other biographies. Not all studies of ancient biography recognize that, but I think when you narrow it down to those within living memory, and we're talking about full length uh, biographies, like the kind you have in Suetonius or Plutarch or Tacitus of his father-in-law, or Josephus's autobiography, although he makes himself look really good there, or Philo's Life of Moses, even, these are from within the right period. And what they show us is that they're depending on prior information, sometimes oral tradition, sometimes written information, and they stick. I mean, they're not out to invent events.
Sure. Well, some scholars obviously would argue that ancient biographers took significant liberties with their material. How does your work in Christobiography challenge or nuance that claim?
First of all, it depends on what period of biography we're talking about.
Okay.
So, like a few centuries before, when the genre was just, beginning to develop, yeah, they did take significant liberties. And certainly in hagiography in late antiquity, they did so. But this is the period where they didn't take such significant liberties. Now, by
Okay.
the standards of modern biography, yeah, they took some liberties. But by the standards of ancient biography, the liberties they took were pretty much in line with the liberties that were taken by ancient historians as well. So, um, how do I go into that? With biography, they didn't have to be in chronological order,
Okay.
and sometimes we can demonstrate they weren't in chronological order. Um, they, for example, Philo, his Life of Moses, he's got two sections. One is in chronological order, the other is arranged topically. Um, and Suetonius arranges things topically often as well, where here are the person's good deeds, here are the person's bad deeds, and so forth. Also, you didn't expect things to be verbatim.
Okay.
So, um, even with historians, a later historian might basically crib an earlier historian's speech of somebody. How do we know what was said in the case? Well, he uses the earlier historian's speech, but he puts it in his own words. He paraphrases.
Okay.
Um, so there were clearly liberties like that, and when somebody wasn't there to hear the speech, the historian would give you the most plausible reconstruction. Today we'd say they might have said this, but ancient historians would just give you the most plausible reconstruction. Or sometimes Josephus writes a few speeches where he was just showing off his rhetorical skills. But those were mostly in histories. But in terms of events, they didn't normally make up events. And in terms of biographies of sages, like teachers, these were often passed on in the schools of those teachers. They were meant um, to recall what the teacher actually taught, rather than to make up uh, ideas for
Okay.
the teacher, and especially within living memory. So I went into comparisons with ancient Greek philosophic schools, ancient education in general. Some people object when I had one article where I mentioned rabbinic memory, and person jumped on that and said, the rabbis are too late. That was only one quarter of the evidence that I cited for ancient schools passing on the memory. I mean, it was the unanimous practice
Okay.
in this period. But anyway, I need to let you talk
No,
more.
I'm fascinated by all of this. Please answer as long as you want. When it comes then to us, debating back and forth sometimes on which gospel writer is more chronological, is it John, is it Mark, or wherever, is that conversation a little redundant then in terms of, well, let's say in terms of say it's uh, you know, non-Christian scholars using that to argue the reliability of the Gospels. That's a silly argument.
I think that's a silly argument. I think it's judging them by the standards of saying, okay, well, here's what we would do in a modern biography, and then imposing a genre that didn't exist yet.
Okay.
I mean, it developed from the ancient one, but imposing that grid on ancient biography and saying, look, the Gospels aren't the way we would write biography, they're unreliable. I mean, I don't even, that argument doesn't even make sense to me
Okay.
because you have to judge them according to the standard for which they were writing. If we can even speak of that as a standard, because there were variations, but certainly in this period, the expectation of uh, peer review, so to speak, or the expectation of people picking up a work that looked to them like a bios, a life of somebody, their expectation would be that this is supposed to actually recount events from the person's life and the substance of their teachings. And we can, as a Christian, I would go further. I have a confidence in the providence of God and the work of the Holy Spirit and so on. But just speaking as a historian, we've got plenty of evidence, plenty of things we can say about Jesus. And in terms of the Gospels having to be chronological, I mean, most most scholars who speak about them being reliable don't require, that's not part of their expectation.
Yeah.
Just, I mean, you compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke, just compare, say, Matthew 8 and 9 with the parallel material in Mark. And there was one person from the Reformation period, Andreas Osiander, who wanted to make sure that everything was in chronological order. So he had to have things repeated multiple times to make them. So Jesus raised Jairus's daughter from the dead 3 times. She was really, really dead, right? I mean, and Calvin said, that's crazy. It's not. And then Luther was even more free with it. Luther said that he thought that Jesus cleansed the temple toward the end of his ministry, where Mark had it, rather than toward the beginning, where John had it, in terms of historically. But he said, who cares
Okay.
whether it was here or there? The issue is he cleansed it. It doesn't affect the gospel. It doesn't affect the gospel message. So most scholars today, and then you've got the cursing of the fig tree, where even within the unit, in Matthew and Mark, they're in different sequence, and it's a day apart.
Yeah.
So, and explicitly, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not it doesn't affect, by the standards of ancient biography, that's not an issue.
Yeah. And would you say the same then, and I think you already did, about the precision of some of the details in the narratives? I remember for a little while I did some study with Craig Evans on Crei
Yeah.
specifically and Crei in Mark, and we were kind of looking together at, uh, you know, in kind of, I don't know, ancient Greco-Roman and Jewish studies as you were learning rhetoric and you learned the art of storytelling and Crei as it fit in there, you were allowed to kind of adjust some details to fit the, I don't know, the purpose of your speech. Would that be accurate? to
Yeah, the
say that
speech.
that doesn't take away, that doesn't disqualify the credibility of the
Yeah.
writers.
Yeah, you can, historians actually would sometimes fill in, um, and sometimes if you've only got so much information and you're trying to recount a story in a cohesive way, there's going to be things you'll inadvertently fill in based on assumption. And then we end up with two of these and they appear to be in contradiction, but it's because we don't have all the information. I know when my wife actually, she was a war refugee in Congo,
Okay.
before we were married, and but we had already been friends. But she gave me, I was taking notes, talking with her after we got back together after the war, and um, and also she had kept a journal. And when I was going through her journal and also my notes, I said, "Wait, like here you said that this was a you were she had malaria. She was spitting into a plastic container, and here she said she was spitting into a bottle." Well, of course, people don't remember all the details, but I asked her, "So which was it, a plastic container or a plastic bottle or a bottle?" She looked at me. She was like, "It was a plastic bottle." like, oh, duh. And I was thinking in these like, um, I think I was assuming a glass bottle, but anyway, um, sometimes we are so picky on those things.
Hmm.
And if we had more information, we could fill in. Or sometimes the person who communicated it made an inference that it was this, um, rather than this. But these are like such minor things. These are not the substance. They don't make any difference in what's being communicated.
Yeah. You emphasize the role, obviously, of eyewitness memory in the transmission of the Jesus tradition. Can I ask, how does your argument build on or differ from Bockham's Jesus and the eyewitnesses, if it does in any significant ways?
I think it agrees with Bauckham,
Okay.
but it disagrees with the way a lot of people have interpreted Bauckham.
Okay.
So a lot of people were taking, I don't know, it's not what he said, but the people who jumped on him afterwards, some of the critiques that came afterwards were like, well, no, people don't remember things exactly. And in terms of, the eyewitnesses didn't write the Gospels. Um, well, that's open to debate with some of them. But be that as it may, nobody says that Luke or Mark were eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry, or at least most of it. I don't think they were, and the ancient church didn't think that they were. Um, and as for Matthew and John, of course, there's debates. I mean, Bauckham argues for, um, the eyewitness who stands behind the Gospel of John, the beloved disciple. Um, that person was an eyewitness, but and that Luke consulted people who were eyewitnesses. But the importance of his argument is, can these things go back to eyewitnesses? So you've got living memory. Would people consult eyewitnesses? Would the the teaching of the eyewitnesses be considered most authoritative? So that's what people would listen to and check things with. Or was it just uncontrolled free tradition of anybody said anything and they could get away with anything? I think Bockham's 100% right
Okay.
on his argument. Not the way people have misrepresented his argument, though, because it doesn't have to be written by an eyewitness to be eyewitness information.
Sure.
So, like if I tell one of my wife's stories, I'm basing it on her eyewitness evidence, or sometimes it'll be, I can tell a story from her brother that I got through her, although I did consult her brother afterwards, trying to be a good historian. um, but yeah, I think he's right. It wasn't, and when he challenges form criticism, I wouldn't do that with a broad brush because there were different kinds of form critics. So you've got Bultmann on the one side, who clearly took things too far, and most people today recognize that. Debelius didn't take things as far as Bultmann did. Then you've got much more conservatively with form critics, somebody like Joachim Jeremias, C.H. Dodd, or especially Taylor, Vincent Taylor, British form critic. But today we have kind of a reformulated form criticism in memory theory. But again, I think we need to distinguish between the period of living memory, which is the period of the Gospels, and a later period. But that's going beyond the biography part. That's just dealing with how things were preserved until the time that they got written down in biographies.
Speaking about some of the pushback to Baucham's work, were there some, as you were writing, even some pushback to your book that you expected uh, that would come that you would be fielding answers for, or maybe some pushback that you didn't expect? What were some of the, as you maybe sat in SBL at maybe taking questions? What were people's biggest concerns with Christobiography?
I don't remember a whole lot of pushback, except um, one colleague, and we're on great terms.
Okay.
But one colleague um, who works on ancient biography, but working on it from a literary perspective and doing a great job with that, uh, suggested that, well, no, ancient biographies aren't that reliable, and cited a work talking about fictionalization in ancient biography.
Okay.
But you actually read that work, it's not saying that ancient biographies were novels or fiction, or that there's no difference. It defines fictionalization so broadly that if you define it that way, I would have to agree with them. It's like the moment you narrativize anything, the very fact that you're putting it into a framework is fictionalization.
Okay.
So the very fact that you're not just giving a list of events, the very fact that you're even choosing certain events to talk about, and the very choice of them, the very um, practice of writing about them or interpreting them, they defined all that as fictionalization. But I would distinguish, and I think they would distinguish if we could, come to agreement on our terminology. I think they would also agree that that's completely different from saying that the writers just made up events or they came up with completely new teachings. I mean, over the period of centuries, maybe legends can do that, obviously, but that wasn't the purpose of biography, certainly in this period. And I think we've shown that, with the work I did and the work my doctoral students have done, just comparing, especially the ones from this period, comparing them with, like if you put Suetonius, Tacitus, and Plutarch in parallel, the way people do often with the Synoptic Gospels, make a synopsis of their content, you'll see that they're overlapping so much. They're not just making things up. It's not to say somebody couldn't have made things up before them, and they did that, but it's prior information on which they're based, and this is especially true when they're writing about figures within the past half century or so.
Some would argue, that the gospel authors were primarily theologians rather than historians. Does your research challenge that distinction? Does that distinction really even matter?
That's been challenged for a long time.
Okay.
Like I Howard Marshall, with his Luke historian or theologian, historian and theologian, because there was a time when people were just saying everything is theological redaction. Well, it is theological, but in terms of the way ancient historians and biographers wrote, as opposed to the way novelists wrote. I mean, novelists have a free hand
Okay.
normally, but
Sure.
I can think of one exception in antiquity where they had a mostly free hand, but they used some material. But um, but novelists could just make up whatever they wanted to. If they were writing about a historical person, which was rare, usually they were writing romances about fictitious characters. But if they were writing about um, a historical person, then they probably want to get some information correct, but not much. They didn't really do research for that. It was just a novel. But in terms of historical works and biographies, often they actually tell us, if you read enough of them, what their historical method was. And it involved pulling, well, using historical information, but they also used it in what they considered an edifying way. So I'm recounting these episodes from the past so that you can have examples for good behavior and here are examples for bad behavior. And usually people can figure out which is which, but sometimes the historian or especially biographer will tell you. Or they can say these are good models for speeches or good models for um, military campaigns or good models for political rulership or so on. They ancient history and biography, it was meant to be engaging, just like novels were. So it'd be fun to read or something interesting. So like not just telling you what the person had for lunch last week, if it was something normal, but if it was the person got poisoned, then they might tell you that because that'd be more interesting. But also it was meant to be based on facts, but these facts were pulled together to make a point.
Okay.
And so the gospels fit that. They don't fit novels. And actually, in terms of novels, so far as I know, in all of antiquity, we don't have a novel about a recent historical figure that is from within living memory. Um, we do have biography and history written then, and that was considered, even in antiquity, on a much more historically reliable level than history or biography written about things in the distant past.
So, I mean, this comes out very clearly in your book, but I wonder if I could just ask you anyway, based on your research, how much confidence do you think we should have, Christians should have, in the historical reliability of the Gospels?
Obviously, I think we should have great confidence in them.
Okay.
Now, as a historian, now I can't pretend to not be a Christian, so I have that
Hmm.
presupposition. But I was an atheist before,
Okay.
and I think that then if I'd looked at this evidence, I would have said, "Wow, we know a lot about Jesus." I think I probably would have demurred from the miracle accounts and said, "Well, they must have just made these up because they didn't believe in miracles." Um, Now, if somebody had given me evidence that miracles did in fact happen, I probably would have backed off even on that and said, "Wow, Jesus was certainly a miracle worker um, and all this." But whether that's some sort of hidden supernatural power latent in human beings, or I, I would, as an atheist, I had all sorts of ways of going around it. But um, no, but I have great confidence, and I think what a historian could say, whether they're Christian or not, is that just like we have a whole lot of historical information about um, Otho, the Roman Emperor Otho. It's only one. Suetonius's biography of Otho is only like 1/5 the length of Mark's Gospel. So when I say a whole lot of information, at least he packs it with prior information. There's a lot we can say, therefore, about um, emperors within that period. I think we should be at least as confident from a purely historical standpoint that, paragraph after paragraph, we're getting a lot of solid information, a lot of solid memory about Jesus.
Maybe this is a weird question, but kind of flipping it, what do you think is the strongest argument against the historical reliability of the Gospels, and how would you respond to that?
The strongest, oh, okay, actually, there's um, piggybacking on something you said earlier. There are a few other ways. One is a completely postmodern reading
Okay.
of, and I'm not um, debating everything in postmodernism. I mean, everything has a perspective and so on. But um, like the extreme postmodern, like Holocaust denial
Hmm.
stuff, there was no Holocaust. It was just a bunch of individual things. You can't group them together under a category. But So for those extreme postmodernist approach, some treat ancient historical works as only rhetoric.
Okay.
Rhetoric was important, especially in elite histories. So, normally beyond the level we have in the New Testament, but Luke is heading somewhat in that direction. But in terms of ancient historiography, yes, you had to tell it in a pleasing way, but you were shaping information. So again, it's different from novels. And so again, if somebody wants to focus just on the rhetoric of historiography or the rhetoric of biography, that's fine. But don't, just because you're focused on that, say it's also not based on information,
Okay.
because that's a completely different genre. Um, and also somebody has argued, and I need to check into this in more detail, but somebody has argued that the Gospels were second century compositions that were pure literary compositions written not even by Christians or something like that. I don't think that's obviously not a majority view.
Hmm.
Uh, but the idea that there's literary value to them, I mean, that part is correct, and that the Gospels were probably dictated to amanuenses rather than just um, that the Gospel authors wrote them down themselves. That's true, but again, those are not really dealing with what I'm talking about here. Um, but in terms of objections, I think the major objection is the reason that people started doubting the Gospels to begin with. And that is, well, look, the Gospels include miracle accounts. 1/3 of Mark's narrative, well, no, one half of his narrative, 1/3 of his Gospel consists of healings, exorcisms, stilling storms, walking on water, things like that. And the response in light of Humean anti-supernaturalism, Hume's essay on miracles and the kind of deist background for that, the idea is, well, no eyewitness would ever claim anything like that. So this material obviously can't go back to eyewitnesses. Now that got qualified a lot when people said, well, there could be psychosomatic recoveries and things like that. No walking on water, but there could be some other things. But all of that presupposes that Hume's argument was right, that these kind of things, no credible eyewitnesses claims, no credible eyewitness claims. But I think whether you believe in miracles technically or not, well, technically it depends on how you define it, but whether you depend on those or not, historically, what we can look at is whether the person was sick and now they're better, and if something like prayer happened in between, and do eyewitnesses ever claim these kind of things? Well, in fact, we have considerable evidence that eyewitnesses do claim these kind of things. There was a Pew Forum survey, I think it was 2006, and the projections based on the percentages in those surveys suggest that we've got hundreds of millions of people today claiming to have witnessed things like this, not walking on water. We've got a few people claiming that, but I mean, in terms of, people who were blind receiving sight and so on, we have medical documentation for some of these cases. So why would we think anything was different in the first century? The people in the first century wouldn't see things they thought were miracles. And as a Christian, I actually believe in this. Is what I brought up to one of my professors who didn't believe in miracles and just would dismiss those accounts. I said, as a Christian, I believe miracles could happen. When I was an atheist, I didn't believe they could happen. But to take an agnostic, neutral starting point, so to speak, and say maybe they happen, maybe they don't, let's look at the evidence. And so I started giving some of my own eyewitness evidence. And, I could have given a lot of other people's, but, since then I've done research where I've collected accounts from doctors and so on as well. Um, but at the time, what I said to the professor is, you hear these things where I experienced this or I witnessed this. Now, if you want to challenge the possibility of these things happening, you're going to have to challenge my credibility as an eyewitness. Whereupon the teacher graciously changed the subject, or other, you idiot, you're just an idiot. He could have said, you're just an idiot, out of the program, but no, he didn't. So,
Well, kind of in a similar line, I guess. How should your findings in this book shape the way scholars now approach the quest for the, or as it's called now, I think, the next quest for the historical Jesus?
I think, I mean, we can still use a lot of the approaches that we use.
Okay.
Some people think we should throw all those approaches out based on social memory. I don't think we need to throw them out. I mean, I think there's still value in some of them. I mean, criterion of dissimilarity, that one we can probably usually throw out.
Okay.
But a lot of the other, multiple attestation and so on, I think they still have value by different names. They're still used in a lot of secular historiography. But having said that, we can start with more of a default trust rather than the default skepticism.
Okay.
So now as a Christian, I start with a default trust, but as a historian, there are documents, well, when I say default trust, historians, and this has been true ever since Polybius, writing before the Gospels, historians will look critically at something and say, how much of this do we trust? But if you've got a source that is usually trustworthy, or if you've got a source from within living memory, or if you've got a source from somebody who actually knew the person about whom they're writing, then you're going to have more of a default trust next time they say something than you'll have a default mistrust. Like historians regularly, there's certain sources we regularly mistrust, like fragments from Ephorus, an ancient historian. Whereas there's others where we would trust more, like Polybius or Thucydides or so on. And I think that we should be willing to approach, keep in mind a default setting when we approach the Gospels, and not just go in saying, okay, we're going to be critical and just ignore how often, look, Matthew and Luke are using Mark, so they're not just making things up here.
Mm-hmm.
We also see that they overlap on other stuff, so they're not making things up there. Why assume they're making things up elsewhere? And if they're writing soon after Mark, they probably knew the kind of writing that Mark was doing. Normally, if you're writing a historical work and you're dependent on sources for your history, and you care enough about information that you're going to depend on sources, you're not going to depend on something is a novel
Mm-hmm.
that's just made up. You're going to depend on something. And I guess, again, if you're writing about the distant past and the best you've got is just a historical novel, you say, well, there might be something here, but that's not the case. The Gospels are from within living memory, and they're from the period where it's the epitome of historical basis in ancient biography, at least when you're writing full-length lives of a person, and the Gospels are within that range. Yeah, I think we should start with more trust in their memory.
Okay. As we wrap up here, Craig, can I ask a more personal question? If you can remember, I mean, this book is a few years old, but I'm sure your research has been also lifelong in preparing for this. How has your research changed how you now personally read or teach the Gospels?
Sure. Well, I try to take this into account. And even, like I mentioned, multiple attestation.
Mm-hmm.
One of my doctoral students did his dissertation on ancient biographers who actually knew the person about whom they were writing. And that
Okay.
was a small number of them. I think maybe he was writing on four of them or so. But when he put them together and tried to test them by multiple attestation, because only a little bit of information has survived from antiquity, we don't have like four early biographies of the person like we do
Hmm.
with the case of Jesus. He found like only 4% of the material was multiply attested. Does that mean they made up 96%? It just means that we don't have more surviving sources. But it also shows us the limitations of how you use multiple attestations. So, if you do have it attested in multiple sources, that's good. But if you don't have it in multiply attested sources, these were people who knew the person about whom they were writing. So chances are, there's a lot of information there, even where you can't show it. So what I um, since the time of Christobiography, I've written a long commentary. It's not out yet, but on the Gospel of Mark.
Okay.
And so you know, um, I deal with literary narrative approaches, but also I'm looking at historical information, especially since Mark is probably it's our first surviving gospel. So I I look at those detailed questions, but also I come with these default assumptions that I state clearly in the introduction, so that when I look, I'm more likely to state, okay, this one is multiply attested in these independent sources. If it's not, though, I don't say, okay, well, this isn't attested in multiple independent sources, so we're just going to throw this out,
Hmm.
historical information. I try to use the criteria more positively, and sometimes I just don't have it, any way to weigh the material specifically. But I believe Mark is writing soon enough after the events, and he's where I can test him. I can find, well, here are things that certainly fit Jesus' Galilean environment. I don't think Mark was from Galilee. Um, I think he was from Jerusalem. Some people think he's from the diaspora, but I don't think he's from Galilee. And yet he gets the Galilean details right,
Hmm.
like with the roof in Capernaum and so on. Um, Luke adjusts it for his audience, the wording in Luke 5:19 from Mark 2:4. But anyway, you can tell I'm ADHD. I'm running all over the place, but usually I come back to the point. Um,
Absolutely. No, again, I'm just fascinated following your yeah, just all the information is stored in your mind. So don't apologize for the rabbit trails. Well, thank you for that answer, Trey. I just want to say thank you so much for Christobiography. Thank you for all of the, I mean, prolific work you've done. But this is this has been an important book for me, as much of your other work. But I've been fascinated by this, and it has only enhanced my confidence in the Gospels. And then to hear you reiterate that, face to face, say how much you trust the Gospels. It's just so inspiring and encouraging, affirming for lay people, for pastors to receive that confidence from scholars, that you're reading all these sources and you're still confident in the life, death, resurrection of Christ.
all the more. And yeah, and the life, death, and resurrection. That's definitely multiply attested.
Yeah. Yeah.
And actually, the death isn't really, well, except in Islam. The death isn't really questioned. 100% mortality rate from antiquity.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, thank you for your time, Craig, and very nice to meet you.